Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV UK edition. I'm your host, Jake Brown. Poetic, passionate, and poignant are all words that Interview magazine has used to describe the way John Boyne has used his gift with them to become one of the best-loved writers of his generation, in the esteemed opinion of the Telegraph UK, while Image magazine has spotlighted him as one of Ireland's most successful novelists. The Irish Independent sang his praises early on in his now nearly 25-year career as one of the most imaginative and adventurous young Irish novelists working today. Based on early successes like his debut The Thief of Time in 2000, which the Sunday Express called extraordinary, and the Herald trumpeted as a delightful epic. The Congress of Rough Riders. Crippen, where the Irish Times observed that Boyne has the ability to create memorable characters and to unfold their various stories in a tightly controlled narrative that shifts backwards and forwards, doling out enough information to keep readers on the edge of their metaphorical seats, while raving of his next hit, Next to Kin, that it proceeded at a narrative pace that never flags for an instant, a solid cast of characters, a vividly imagined recreation of a particular historical moment. If thrillers are to work, they must be thrilling, and this is where Boyne scores highest of all. The Washington Post would next chronicle his rocket ride to global fame after millions got to know Boyne from his young adult book about the Holocaust, The Boy with Striped Pajamas, which the Wall Street Journal felt was beautiful and deeply affecting, while USA Today found the best-selling novel, which penetrated hearts in mainstream literature all over the globe, to be powerful and unsettling as a novel that they crowned as memorable as The Diary of Anne Frank. Boyne's YA successes continued in tandem with his contemporary ones, over subsequent bestsellers like Mutiny on the Bounty, Noah Barleywater Runs Away, The Terrible Thing That Happened to Barnaby Brockett, Stay Where You Are and Then Leave, where the Bulletin for the Center of Children's Books admired the achievement that as much about familial love as about war, this novel tugs at the heartstrings, creating a sentimental but sound story that would shine as a classroom read-aloud. The Boy at the Top of the Mountain would similarly move the School Library Journal, who found that Boyne delivers another powerful allegory in the compelling World War II story, and My Brother's Name is Jessica more recently. Returning to the contemporary realm, John's wild successes continued over The House of Special Purpose, which the Times UK praised as an exciting, fast-paced story that compels the reader through its 70-year span, absorbing and richly satisfying, and The Absolutist, where the Daily Beast highlighted what is most memorable here is the timeless doomed relationship between Tristan and Will, marked by tenderness, confusion, and cruelty in the face of their own internalized repression. This is a wonderfully crafted tragedy that will stay with the reader. Glamour complimented This House is Haunted as a classic Dickensian ghost story that the New York Times Book Review discovered to be a richly horrifying experience, a gothic manse, honeycomb with secret passages, occult symbolism, and a subterranean river of terror, all there for the right lucky reader to stumble upon in the dead of night. While the Daily Mail UK took the position upon reading A History of Loneliness that with this exceptional piece of fiction, Boyne has explored a subject with insight and sensitivity with which most would shy away from. It's a brave, angry, and powerful novel which sheds new light on a dark chapter in Ireland's history. The Heart's invisible fury so moved Oprah Winfrey's O magazine as to call it bleak, bittersweet, and Irish to the bone, and Vanity Fair found that A Ladder to the Sky spins out over several decades with thrilling unpredictability, following Maurice as he masters the art of co-opting the stories of others in increasingly dubious ways. And while the book reads as a thriller with a body count that would make Highsmith proud, it's also an exploration of morality and art. He's continued to entertain new generations of readers with his recent hits like A Traveler at the Gates of Wisdom, The Echo Chamber, and All the Broken Places. And he's here today to talk all about his bold career in literature. John, welcome to the show.
The library, I think. There was there still is a fantastic library just down the road from my parents' house, a very old library, and over 2 floors. And the kids section was on the top floor. And I used to go down there every Wednesday. We used to get a half day from school on a Wednesday. So I'd go down to the library and I would take out 3 books. And you know the way when you're a kid, I think you reread more as a kid than you do as an adult, that you want to go back to those favorite books. And so there was always that feeling of, I can only take 3 books. You know, which ones will I take? Will I take a new one? Will I take one I've read before? And, you know, in those days, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and we didn't have other distractions. We didn't have computers and social media and all that. So reading was very much part of my life, but reading and writing together were always completely connected. I really couldn't have done one without the other. But the library was the place that really excited me the most. I felt instinctively, I think, at home in a building full of books. Well, I remember an author called H.E. Todd, who seems to be forgotten now, but he wrote a series of books about Bobby Brewster, who was a little boy where inanimate objects would come to life around him. and then he would have these adventures. And I loved those. I loved the Narnia books, even though I'm not really a fantasy guy at all. But the Narnia books really excited me. I liked that. I particularly liked books where kids were really left on their own in the world and had to solve their own problems. Where the adults were either killed off very early on or just were dumping them somewhere for the summer, and they had no supervision. I liked that. And even in the books I've written for young people, I tend to get rid of the adults quite quickly and just have the children sort of either being quite lonely or being quite just in charge of their own lives. So I liked that a lot. And I also, maybe, because I turned out to be a writer and everything, I did get into kind of classic adventure fiction quite young, things like Treasure Island and Kidnapped and Three Musketeers, those kind of books, kind of big adventure novels that maybe people don't write so much anymore. I was probably reading those around 10 or 11 before kind of graduating onto Dickens. And I started reading Dickens around 12, 13. And again, I started really with the orphan books. I always just, again, it's like the kid left on their own. And for some reason, I just really liked books about orphans. So yeah, I mean, it was just always like one book leading to another really in that building. And then eventually being able to come downstairs rather than upstairs to the adult section. I have a tattoo here. You can just about see it. And it says, "We are all terminal cases." Let me get it better. There we are. "We are all terminal cases," which is the last line of a very famous book. And 10 points, if you can guess what that book is. It's the full sentence is, "In the world according to Garp, we are all terminal cases." So I think John Irving was one of the early writers that I came to as a teenager when I was moving from the young adult fiction into kind of big adult books. And I remember reading The Cider House Rules at that age, The World According to Garp. And he was definitely kind of my big inspiration. And, as in subsequent years has gone on to be kind of a very good friend of mine and kind of my mentor in many ways in my own writing career. But I got so excited about those books, those kind of big buildings romance, where starting from the birth of a child all the way to death and all the adventures that would happen. And of course, he wrote a lot about what he called sexual misfits, which was kind of exciting for like a 14-year-old boy to be reading about. And I really liked his books a lot. I also liked, in terms of the classics, I always liked E.M. Forster. I always enjoyed those classic kind of Merchant Ivory adaptations. So I went back to kind of a lot of those, Room of the View, Harrod's End, all that. I enjoyed those books. Who else? Evelyn Waugh, I was very interested in, and read all of Evelyn Waugh's books. Also, I was, as my teenage years, I was growing up at a time where there was a whole generation of Irish writers who were very much coming to the fore and really making names for themselves and selling a lot of books and having movies made and winning prizes, which gave me inspiration because I knew at that age I wanted to write, and it made me feel that it was not such a crazy ambition that a boy from Dublin could go on and become a successful writer.
Introduce viewers, if you would, to review your career studying for your bachelor's degree at Trinity College, Dublin in English, and then your master's degree from the University of East Anglia, and any professors who you found especially inspiring or illuminating as you begin to discover your voice and refine your craft as a young writer.
I didn't get a lot of encouragement in school, I have to say. It wasn't a place I would look back on with great fondness. They didn't really encourage creativity at all. It was very much like English classes were very much about writing essays, very dry nonfiction essays rather than writing a story. And while I could write essays and I enjoyed doing them because I enjoyed putting words together, I would have much preferred to be able to just write stories. That was where my brain was, fiction. And then in Trinity, there was a few. David Norris taught me the novel at one point. And David Norris is a very well known here. He's a senator. He's also the guy who really spent decades working towards gay rights in Ireland. He ran for president at one point. He's really fantastic human being. Brendan Kennelly as well. He taught me at one point, and a fantastic Irish poet. He died sadly a couple of years ago. And I felt certainly in Trinity that I could. I was studying literature, but I felt I had the freedom to write more. I could sit in the library and write stories, and I was writing. I must have written a couple of hundred stories between the age of about 15 and early 20s. I was just writing stories constantly, the way a songwriter would have been writing songs every single day at that age. And really just trying to figure out how to write dialogue and characters and themes. And serious ones and comic ones, and really just I found it incredible. It was a very exciting kind of time in my life because I felt with everything I was doing, I could tell that most of it wasn't very good, but I could also tell it was getting better, and I felt that's the right way to be. I'm just a kid still, and but I'm doing this all the time, and it will come good. And then once in a while, maybe I would write something that I felt pretty good about.
Now, some of your first affirmations and positive reader feedback would come through publishing short stories, a time-honored tradition through which so many young authors first see their name in print and put their work before readers, including yours while still at university beginning in 1992 with The Entertainment's Jar, which ran in the Sunday Tribune way back in 1992, and other encouraging highlights like You Think You Need Someone, published by Concrete Magazine in 1995, and Donations, published in 1997. How key do you feel these early successes were, both seeing your name in print and building your early confidence toward maybe feeling like you could do this professionally for a living one day?
And then, as you say, I started publishing some stories in newspapers and magazines. And that, of course, was a great encouragement, because then it was a stranger saying, actually, yeah, we think you might have something here. So it was an exciting time. In those years, between 94, say, and 2000, I had gone to UEA in England to do the creative writing course under Malcolm Bradbury. And I think I started writing stories there that were much more personal. Before that, I think I was being very influenced by, I remember giving in stories at the start of that class, and Malcolm Bradbury said to me, this is your J.D. Salinger story, and this is your Philip Roth story, and this is, he could tell who I'd been reading and when I'd been reading it. And he very much encouraged me to, to abandon all of that and just find my own style, my own voice. So I remember giving in a story to class. I can't actually remember what it was called, but I think on my third submission, where I got rid of all of that influences, I think, and I wrote something just very personal about myself growing up, and growing up in Dublin, and various bits and pieces that had happened to me. And I gave it in to class, sort of feeling I was being quite vulnerable in doing that, because everything I'd written before had very much been removed from my own life. It had been really just pure storytelling, and that was exciting. But then from then on, I really started just writing novels. And like most writers, I think, I've got a few novels on the computer that were written before my first published novel, The Thief of Time, each one kind of getting me one step further. And looking back, it seems like it was decades between, UEA, and at the time it seemed like decades. It was only 5 years between leaving UEA and getting my first novel published. But I guess because I was a young guy in my mid-20s, early 20s, and you think the world is passing you by, I felt like, oh my God, is this ever going to happen? And my ambition had always been, I wanted to get a novel published by the time I was 30. And I got it published when I was 29. So, just pulled it in under the wire.
Let's turn to that first novel, The Thief of Time, which Time Out complimented as a masterpiece of organization and historical sampling. As you first travel with readers back to 1758, where we meet Matthew Zelia fleeing Paris after witnessing a murder, what did you find most exciting about crafting a story that impressively wound through different eras of history before, as the Sunday Express concluded like so many, the various strands of the extraordinary story are resolved with a stylish twist and genuine warmth?
Those couple of novels that I mentioned that weren't published, they were actually quite personal things, and it wasn't really working for me. I wasn't getting published, and I think I was trying to write about myself a lot, even though there wasn't very much happening in my life. So I made a deliberate decision. I decided to write a historical novel, or at least partly half historical. And I've always liked history. I've always read history, and I've always enjoyed historical novels. So I thought I would give that a shot. And I just had this idea, this opening line, I don't die, I just get older and older and older. And, the idea, it's not the most original idea in the world, but that, somebody whose body doesn't age, and so therefore who goes through all these different periods of history and is affected by each one and affects each one. But he has a nephew that keeps dying, but not before, procreating. So there's another nephew to come in the next section. And he realizes in time that what he has to learn as the narrator is to save one of these boys. And if he can save one of these boys, he can finally get out of life that he's been living for 256 years. And of course, he tells it on the night that 1999 becomes 2000. So the night of the millennium. And he looks back at these 256 years. And I chose a lot of periods of history that I was already interested in, that I'd read about a lot. So for example, I was always interested in Charlie Chaplin. There's a chapter on 1920s Hollywood. There's a chapter on the French Revolution. And what else? There's, I think, the first modern Olympic Games. So lots of kind of big events that I could put my hero into. And, it could be quite colorful, and I could find out all the facts about them, and, write effectively what were very kind of long stories about each one before moving on to the next bit.
It must have been quite a feeling of victory to then walk past your local bookshop and see this for sale in the window or on shelves, after such an initial push to get it out to sea, so to speak.
It was, but also I was working in the biggest bookshop in Dublin at the time. So not only was I holding it, but it was out there on the table, sort of in front of me. And on occasion, somebody would come up to buy a copy, and I would be the guy behind the till, scanning it through the till, which was kind of surreal at times. So that was exciting, but yeah, I mean, it never goes away. I've published 21 books now, and when that box arrives with the new book, and you hold it, and you look at it, and then you put it through with the other books on the shelf, that never goes away, and I don't think it ever should. It should always feel like an accomplishment and something wonderful.
Had you already by then had the idea for the Congress of Rough Riders floating around in your imagination?
Yeah, that was it. Not really. It was tricky because actually, I think most second novels are tricky because you generally get a 2-book deal. So for the first time in your life, you're writing a book that theoretically is going to be published, assuming it isn't absolute rubbish, And so I struggled in a way with that. And it's also sort of partly historical and partly contemporary about Buffalo Bill. And I would say of all of my books, it's probably artistically my least successful, but it is quite ambitious, I think. I think I threw a lot into it, but I think it's okay kind of to look back at your books and say, maybe there are some that you did everything you could with, but you just didn't quite knock it out of the park in the way that you might have wanted to.
Believe me, in over 50 books of my own, I have had several of those, especially early on. You continue to really find your groove telling historical murder mysteries within the pages of Crippen, where the Irish Examiner found that it confirmed you as one of the best and original of a new generation of Irish authors. Before then, what proved most intriguing to you about the real-life case of Dr. Hawley Crippen, whose wife was found deceased in his cellar to then cause him to set sail with the dock, and readers aboard the SS Montrose for this murder mystery that unfolds on the ship?
I think, the story of Dr. Crippen, where I put my own spin on it, and I use a lot of gender stuff in that book because the first thing I heard about when I was doing my research on Dr. Crippen was the fact that he took his lover Ethel on the boat with him, but dressed her as his son when they were fleeing. So they spent, a couple of weeks fleeing to Canada, but dressed as father and son, even though they were lovers. And I thought, well, there's something kind of weird and creepy and interesting about that. At what point do they kind of get off on that? So, there was a great way into the story in terms of using gender and things in that. And I liked the fact that, there was the setup was all there for me in a way that I could take this boat across the Atlantic, but keep flashing back to London to everything that led to the murder.
The Irish Times complimented The Next of Kin as being complete with a solid cast of characters and a vividly imagined recreation of a particular historical moment. How did this trip back to the 1930s London drive you as you created what they ultimately argued was a narrative pace that never flags for an instant?
Then Next of Kin was really the first book I wrote which wasn't based on anything historical, where it was just an invented story. So I definitely, I look back on those with fondness, and I think I was growing as a writer, definitely. I think there's a lot of good storytelling in them, good ambitious writing.
Reuters would point out just a few years into your career that John Boyne set out to write contemporary novels, but his fascination with history kept taking him back in time. And continuing in that spirit, you transitioned this time inside the friendship between Bruno, the son of the Auschwitz commandant, and the 11-year-old Jewish boy named Shmuel. Please take fans around the world of your first YA novel back inside the heart of creating, of what USA Today ultimately concluded to be a powerful and unsettling work.
I had always been very, very interested in the Holocaust since I was about 15. And I'd really read widely on the subject. It was just kind of like my pet subject in a way as a reader. It was something I would go back to in terms of nonfiction works and biographies, and always trying to understand it better, to try to understand it, to try to figure it out. And generally, I mean, we can't, but we read in order to understand it. And I think all of that reading came together to the idea that I originally had, which was just the two boys at the fence. And when I started writing it, it wasn't that I thought to myself, I'd never thought about writing for young people. And I was 3 or 4 chapters in when it sort of occurred to me that because I'm writing about a 9-year-old boy, that maybe this is a book for young readers. And I knew it was going to be a short book as well. And as soon as I thought that, it seemed, I just thought, well, that's fine, and it didn't seem important in a way that, the audience that I was writing for. I just wanted to write the story. But when I finished it, I did give it to my agent with the words "a children's book" on the front. So I was very clear in my head that I was writing a book for young people, even though I'd never planned on it. I was surprised in a way that it then broadened out the way that it did, and that it became something for adults as well as young people. But you mentioned earlier that children's books, young people's books have changed in many ways. And, you know, the lines between the two are much blurrier. I mean, the books that I call my adult books, I think can be read by, you know, intelligent teenagers. And the books that I call my young adult books can be read and are read by adults. So it's really more now about sort of who the central character is. If the central character is an adult, I call it an adult book. If it's the central character is a kid, I call it a kid's book. But Striped Pajamas just came from all of those years of reading and researching and learning about the Holocaust.
Within writing through a young child's eyes, living through such a unique existence to most children that age, what do you feel like you tapped into that took such hold with readers?
I think there was two things. I think one is the central friendship between Bruno and Shmuel, the Jewish boy. And I think people who read the book really cared about them and cared about the journey they went on and are shocked by the ending that happens. And the other thing, I think, is Bruno's naivety. You know, he's a 9-year-old boy in Poland in the early 1940s. He's at a concentration camp, but he doesn't understand what it is. He doesn't have the knowledge that you or I have. He's literally looking at that fence every day, asking what's going on the other side of that. And I always saw that as sort of a metaphorical idea, that that's what we do when we read about the Holocaust or we study it. We are going to a fence and looking across and asking, what's going on over there and why? Why did this happen? So I think people just cared. He's kind of like, all the kids in my books tend to be quite good-hearted, innocent, naive, polite, good readers, and endearing to the reader. And then when something bad happens to them, as it does in this book, I think the reader then feels quite distraught at the end of it. And I was quite deliberate that there's only like 3 pages after the big climactic scene at the end, because I wanted the reader then to basically have to put the book down and go, well, that's it, it's over. Which is, you know, comes as a big surprise to people. I remember when we did the movie tour in the States and in Europe, we would go, myself and the director and some of the actors, and we would show up at the cinema that was showing the thing, 10 minutes before the end, before doing the Q&A. And you could always sort of tell when people hadn't read the book, if how many people hadn't, because when the ending would come and the film would end, everybody would be like, what, why aren't they saved? This is not a Hollywood movie. This is, how can you have such a dark ending? And, but it's a truthful ending, it's an honest one.
When word came down that such a powerful cast of actors and actresses, including Vera Farmiga, Asa Butterfield, Jack Scanlon, and David Thewlis, among so many more, will be bringing these unforgettable characters you created to life on screen and would prove to be equally unforgettable performances, and in the capable hands of screenwriter-director Mark Herman, that must have been maybe just a little bit overwhelming.
It was optioned before it was published. The film scouts had got it to David Heyman, who produced it and was producing the Harry Potter movies and everything at the time. And so I went to see him, but I'd not gone through that experience before, so I wasn't. It wasn't that I thought it wasn't going to really happen. I thought we'll have a few meetings, and it'll end up as so many of these things do in years of development. But it came together very, very quickly. But it's when I look back, it's part of like these 3 or 4 years where everything in my life was Boyne the Striped Pajamas. I was traveling for the first time all over the world, doing festivals. The book was just selling millions and millions. And I was suddenly gone from being kind of like a little known Irish writer to being kind of a literary celebrity and being invited everywhere. And the movie was just really in some ways part of that, but an exciting part of that. And yeah, I was on set. We shot it in Budapest. And I went over a few times and watched it being made. And that was exciting. And I got on very well with the director and the producers, and still friendly with them to this day. I think they did a really, really good job. I subsequently dedicated one of my novels to the 3 of them. So I have friends who went through negative experiences, but mine was very positive.
What inspired you to want to tell the classic story of Mutiny on the Bounty from young John Jacob Turnstile's point of view as he's just boarding Captain Blythe's HMS Bounty with no idea what's ahead of him?
I always loved the Bounty. Whenever there's the 3 movies, and whenever they're on, I watch them. For some reason, I just could never get enough of it. But I had read years earlier a nonfiction book about the Bounty, and what I realized was that the movies they all portrayed it in the same way, where Captain Bligh was this monster and Fletcher Christian is this heroic, Clark Gable, Marlon Brando, Mel Gibson. And the truth of the story was so different that in real life, Captain Bligh was actually a very humane captain. He was the first captain to bring an entire crew all the way across from England to Tahiti without once whipping anybody. And Fletcher Christian, of course, puts these 19 men out onto a boat to dehydrate and starve and die a horrible death. And the movies do it the other way around. So I thought, actually, what I want to do is I want to write a novel where it's portrayed in the real way, where Captain Bligh is the hero and Mr. Christian is the villain of the piece. So I did it through the eyes of this young boy who is the cabin boy to Lieutenant Bligh, and he is observing events all the way up to Tahiti, then to the Bounty, to the mutiny, and then goes off with the captain in the boat afterwards. And through his eyes, we actually see the story in a fresh way, through the truth. And I think that was one of the exciting things about writing that book, was that to really change people's perceptions of what took place there, but actually to tell the truth.
The New York Times found a story within your next YA novel that was part adventure, part fairy tale, part coming of age, an unusual one, told largely by a mysterious old toy maker to a precocious little boy, in a charming and cleverly plotted story that tiptoes with humor and compassion. What themes were you exploring here in Noah Barleywater Runs Away?
Noah, which was my second YA book, in the same way that Congress of a Friday is my second adult book, I think Noah is one that I look back at with sort of mixed feelings, because there's a fantasy element to it, and I'm not really a fantasy guy, and I'm not entirely sure I pulled it off. But it's ambitious in its way. It takes this idea of the magical forest and the Pinocchio story, and I bring that into it. But building it around the idea of a boy whose mother is going to die, and he's trying to get away from the house. If he's not there, it can't happen. So I think there's a lot in it. I'm not sure if it's my best one, but I think there's something in it.
Let's take viewers to where your imagination took flight next, with a floating lead protagonist, the terrible thing that happened to Barnaby Brockett.
I was walking my dog in the park across the road from my house one day, and he was on his lead, and just as he was pulling away, a squirrel went by or something, and he was charged off, and I lost the lead and off he went. And I don't know, I guess because my brain works in these ways as a fiction writer, I just had this idea of holding a lead with a boy floating on it, a boy who wouldn't obey the law of gravity, and he was sort of a kite, and letting go, and what would happen? He'd float around the world. And it's a comic story in itself, but it's also about, it touches on gender, I think, in many ways, because it's about a boy who his parents don't think he's normal. They want him to be normal. He's not normal because he floats, but it's a metaphor for other kind of unusual or different traits, whatever. And wanting to show kids that actually it not only is it okay to be different, it's actually kind of cool to be different. And other than the echo chamber, that's the one that has the most jokes in it, I think. And it was a lot of fun writing that, writing about a floating boy and trying to find different places for him to land around the world, and how would he land, and why would he take off again, and who would he meet.
An equally important part of what you're doing in writing toward this audience is showing them as well that it's okay to be themselves, as cliche as that sounds. Would you agree?
People who are writers or painters or musicians or filmmakers probably have that inside themselves anyway. I think the essence of creativity is wanting to be, is feeling that you're different in some way, that you're using a part of your brain maybe that most people maybe just don't get an opportunity to use, or just can't tap into. So I think there's a sort of a non-conformism to being an artist to begin with.
When you look over other young adult titles like The Boy at the Top of the Mountain and My Brother's Name is Jessica, what do you feel are some of the signatures that have wove their way throughout this portion of your catalog?
3 of the 6 are about war: Striped Pajamas, Boy at the Top of the Mountain, and Stay Where You Are and Then Leave. About gender in one way or another: My Brother's Name is Jessica and Barnaby Brockett. And one is about the death of a parent. So what I tend to do in all of those books is put a child in the center of a very adult experience well before their time. And unfortunately, as we all know, children do occasionally go through very adult experiences, like the death of a parent, at far too young an age. And so when I write those books for young people, I want to write something that could affect them in their lives, but will tell them a little bit about the world, perhaps give them some hope in the world. In Boy at the Top of the Mountain, which I think is definitely by far my best young adult novel, The way, how easy it was for Piero in that book to go from being the good little boy he is at the start to being corrupted into the Nazi ideals, and the whole use of uniforms in that book, and which I also use in A History of Loneliness with the priests, the way the uniform gives you power, and the way he eventually reaches this place where he has become the absolute opposite of who his real soul is. And only at the end of the war does he realize what he's done, what he's been responsible for. And he too is going to have to spend a lifetime making up for that. Guilt, I guess, just seems to keep going through my books. I'm not sure why.
It must have been welcome throughout your noveling career to be able to escape into the shorter format of story, like those contained within the collection Beneath the Earth.
I don't write so many anymore. So when I do write them, it tends to be for getting asked to write one for maybe an anthology or something. But I started out that way, as we said at the start. I wrote so many stories, and I had a lot of stories published over the years, and I liked the idea of, I wanted to put like some of them into a collection and then write some more fresh today. So I think there's maybe 10 or 11 stories in that book, and I think 5 of them were originally published somewhere else, and then 5 or 6 were written for the book. And it was just nice to kind of go back to short fiction. But even since then, I don't think I've written very much short fiction since.
What took you next into the Russian Revolution, this time telling the story from the other end of the age spectrum, specifically through 80-year-old Georgy Yakimev's voice and memories? Did you visit St. Petersburg and the Winter's Palace Tsar and everywhere else readers travel in this story throughout writing The House of Special Purpose?
I seem to have written a lot of books that are narrated by very elderly people or very young people, and not so much in the middle. And I seem to like both. I like the innocence of childhood, but I like the wisdom of old age. So I think there's 4 or 5 books maybe that I've written that are narrated by people in their 80s or 90s, and including the first one, which of course he's 256. But my grandfather had a copy of Robert Massey's book, Nicholas and Alexandra, on his shelves. It was a beautiful edition of it, and I read it when I was a teenager. And I became very interested in that era, the whole end of the Tsardom and start of the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks and Lenin, all of that. But I've always liked sort of power stuff, kings and queens and czars and captains of boats, that kind of power, and juxtaposing somebody in a position of power with somebody who has none. So like on the Bounty, we've got the captain and the cabin boy. In House of Special Purpose, we've got the Tsar and his teenage bodyguard, or the bodyguard of the Tsarevich anyway. And it's kind of a nice way to tell a story, to see it through those eyes. And again, I go back and forth through time with Georgie, who is now in his 80s, looking back at the revolution and the years leading up to it. But then we go back to him as a teenager when he, first arrives in St. Petersburg, and the gradual destruction of the Tsar's family, Rasputin, all of that. Great colorful period of history to write about. I wrote a lot of it in the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. I went there for a few months, and I would literally just go there into the Hermitage every day, sit down in the coffee shop or the library or something and just write, and trying to kind of get all those ghosts of the past onto the page. And I was there during a real Russian winter, which I don't know if you've ever been before, but if you're going to go to St. Petersburg, go in the winter because you get the real feel of it. You feel like you've stepped back in time, which I think helped me in terms of the writing of the book.
Interview Magazine would discover within the pages of The Absolutist that you had gotten into Tristan Sadler's head brilliantly, constructing a compelling first-person narrative that takes us from the horrific front to the devastated countryside after the war. Could we use this book to examine your process for outlining an epic as elaborate as this one? And the course of crafting what Interview ultimately concluded was a story about self-discovery, friendship, and how far bravery can take us.
What an outliner. No, I really just make them up as I go along. But yourself, a lot of it is in the rewriting. But The Absolutist is a very important book for me because it was a turning point, I think, for myself as a writer, in that it was the first book that I wrote that I felt really, really proud of. I thought it was the best book I'd written at the time. It was the best book I'd written at the time. It was my first novel to include a gay subject matter in terms of the friendship between and the romance between Tristan and Will in that book. And it's a short enough book as well. Most of my adult books at the time were quite long. And this one is much more concise, I think. And I think it tells a very romantic story and a very personal story. And again, that elderly narrator looking back with regret and wisdom, which is a recurring theme in my books, looking back at a moment in life that it's maybe kind of messed up the whole journey of life. To this day now, I still feel very, very proud of that book.
What then inspired you to weave the remaining threads of this story through Ali Summerfield's journey in the young adult title, Stay Where You Are and Then Leave?
I think I wrote it a couple of years after The Absolutist, and I hadn't touched too much on shell shock in The Absolutist, and I wanted to go back to the First World War and write about that, and some of the characters overlap between them. And yeah, I like the idea of a boy who thinks his father is dead because nobody will tell him where he is, but actually he's locked up in a home, in an asylum, effectively, being treated for like something terrible that's happened to him in the war. And that when he discovers this, it's a mission then. I'm going to break my father out. I'm going to go find him. I'm going to save the day, reunite my family. There's a lot of that, I think, in young adult fiction, the idea of the family, of trying to, kids don't want their family to be broken up. They want them to be completely connected. I remember, because he shines shoes in, isn't he, in King's Cross or Paddington Station, I can't remember, and makes money that way. And then, occasionally the Prime Minister or something will get his shoes first, but that's where he gets access to newspapers, and he starts reading about the war. And that's, he starts learning about, he's looking at it every day, seeing all the names of the people who've died, checking, is his father on that list? And then he starts reading about these hospitals, and he's just a kid. He's not going to school, and he's shining shoes to make money for his mother. I remember originally the original title in my head was Someone Stole My Shoe Shine Box. And I thought the idea was going to be about that, like the only way his family could make money was him shining shoes, and then someone steals his shoe shine box. And what would he do then? But the story kind of just changed as I was writing it. But I still think that was a pretty good title, Someone Stole My Shoe Shine Box.
Do you find it important throughout any time in history or, say, physical geography that you're writing about within the story to actually have stood there yourself on the ground in the locales you're writing in and about?
I did that, but I also I spent a lot of time at the Imperial War Museum in London as well, and I wrote a portion of it there. And I also read a lot of letters. I wanted to read letters from soldiers at the front. But what I tried to do is I tried to get letters from, say, people who had multiple letters. So you might get their early ones when they arrive until either they die or they come home. And the way the tone changes, because of course the tone of the boys in that book when they first arrive at Aldershot to train is very different than the tone when they're in the trenches, and they realize the reality of war. And they start, I do remember, I think I had 19 or 20 boys in that regiment, and I had a list of them on my wall, and I would tick them off, when I killed them off. And, I was getting down to like the last 2 or 3, which is the central characters. So yeah, reading a lot, but eventually you do have to put all those books aside and, focus on the imagination.
How fully do you inhabit the characters you're walking in throughout a story like this one, or any really from your very colorful catalog?
I'd be thinking about them through the day without sort of actively meaning to. I might just go for a walk and I'll be thinking about what's going to happen next in the book, and the tone of the characters sort of stays with me. And because especially when I write the first draft, I make sure to write every single day until I get that first draft down, to get like the story all the way through, but also to kind of keep the tone as consistent as possible. And I generally, like the narrators, even though they can be quite ambiguous characters. I mean, Tristan, the narrator of this, is quite an ambiguous character. He has tried to live a good life, but he has also made some really awful mistakes in his life, as have the narrators of some of the other books that are coming up. And it's that question of, do you get to the end of your life and feel has the good outweighed the bad, or has this 1 or 2 moments of massive mistake, has that destroyed everything that you might have been?
The New York Times Book Review, like so many readers, found This House is Haunted to be a richly horrifying experience, a gothic manse, honeycombed with secret passages, occult symbolism, and a subterranean river of terror, all there for the right lucky reader to stumble upon in the dead of the night. Did you base creepy Gaudlin Hall, where Eliza Cain's horrors ensue in a real mansion from the 1800s in or around Norfolk?
For that book, I actually had the title first, This House is Haunted. For years, I always wanted to write a ghost story. And when I finished The Absolutist, that had really kind of taken it out of me because it's so personal. And I just felt I needed to do something that was fun. And a ghost story can be fun. And I wanted to take all those kind of traditional tropes, the governess, the scary children, the big house, the fog, and try to put my own spin on it. But what I realized early on is that as the writer of a ghost story, you don't have to explain why ghosts exist, but you do have to explain why your ghost exists. So I had to come up with a reason why, if the house is haunted, why is it haunted? Why is this woman hanging around the house going, woo, like a ghost, and haunting them? And I think I came up with a pretty good reason for that. But you have to have that, I think, because otherwise the reader will feel shortchanged at the end of it.
The Daily Beast would complement several aspects of A History of Loneliness's creation, from their feeling after reading that your plotting and pacing are first rate, and mastery of the slow boil is also evident. Please talk for viewers, if you would, about how you build up to that as you did so effectively here, tackling such touchy territory throughout Orden Yeats' 40-year story arc here.
I was about 12, 13 books in then, and I had never written about Ireland. And I was always asked up to that point, why don't you write about Ireland? And I'd always sort of said that I just haven't got a story I want to tell yet. But then I felt in the right place to tell this. I grew up as a Catholic. I went to the kind of school that is portrayed. In fact, I went to the very school that's portrayed in the book. I was an altar boy. When I was growing up, my next door neighbor on one side was the parish priest, and on the other side was 9 nuns. So I was the meat in that particular sandwich. And I fell out with the church pretty early, around 20. Because there was a lot of sexual abuse in the school that I went to, and a lot of it was at the hands of priests, and a lot of it, those who weren't priests were quite complicit in it because they knew what was going on. And I'm part of that generation of people who have found themselves at times in police stations in Ireland telling a story about something that happened to us when we were kids. And so I wanted to write about that, and I felt I was in a place where I didn't want to write about the criminal. Originally my plan was I wanted to write about the guy who has, been in the priesthood all his life, has given his life to it, has not committed any crimes, has tried to do his best, but is tarred with the same brush as everybody else. But as I wrote the book, what I realized was that my narrator, in fact, while free of criminal activity, was himself complicit in it, because there's so many moments in the book where something is taking place and he just turns away. He doesn't want to see it. And what I look back in Ireland in those years is that a very small minority of priests committed criminal acts, but a very large majority knew they were going on. So the question to the reader is, is that, are they as guilty? Is that, again, I mentioned earlier that, I think I did anyway, that, complicity comes up a lot in my books, rather than the criminal, the person who knows what's going on and does nothing about it. And this book is one where I really, really got my teeth into that. And also it gave me the freedom to write about Ireland and the years I was growing up. And even though it's a dark book, it was actually quite an enjoyable book to write in many ways, because it was quite cathartic. And I could write about the streets I grew up on, the school I went to, the kind of people I grew up with, the kind of society I did. So there was, all of that was up there at the back of my head. And in all of these other books, writing about wars and revolutions and Russia and all that, I wasn't using any of that. And finally, it was just kind of flooded out into, 2 books in a row, because once I finished History of Loneliness, I went on to Hearts and Visible Furies immediately after it, I think. And because I just wasn't done with writing about Ireland yet.
People magazine would rave throughout reading The Hearts and Visible Furies that, by terms whimsical and heartbreaking, Boyne's sprawling novel treads Dickensian territory across 7 decades of Irish history. Please talk about that immersive writing experience on the way to ending with redemption for both country and native son. One of the Guardians similarly found in some to be a substantial achievement.
There was so much more to say. And when I started writing that book, it was at the time when the equal rights marriage referendum was on the table. It was coming up in the next year or so. It seemed obvious that it was going to pass, which it did. But when I had been in university only 20 years earlier, homosexuality was still illegal. So, to go from that to being the first country in the world to actually vote by public plebiscite for equal rights marriage in 20 years seemed like, it's a blink of an eye. And I wanted to understand how that had happened. And I mentioned John Irving earlier, and the book is actually dedicated to John. And it is my most Irving-esque book in many ways. It does take that whole life story, and it takes, it's got comedy, it's got drama, it's got tragedy. The central character is gay. So it seemed appropriate to dedicate it to John, because I definitely nicked some of his themes, shall we say, or in homage to some of his themes. But I think it's my best book. It's the one that I look back on with the most pride. And it's the one that actually people talk to me the most about these days.
That's the measure of any book's real success in a way, isn't it? That is the measure of any book's real success in a way, isn't it? Some would argue that's the real measure of any book's success, isn't it? I like some would argue better than that.
I said Hearts of Risen Furies is my best book. I think Ladder to the Sky is my second best.
The Washington Post did as well, and made an important observation within their glowing review that the story reminds us that fine literature is often the only opportunity we have to spend quality time with truly ghastly people. We'd recoil from such friends in real life, but in the illicit safety of a novel, the murderer, the thief, and the fraud can seem irresistible. And Maurice Swift is no exception, in a story that dazzled critics like Vanity Fair for the way it spins out over several decades with thrilling unpredictability. Please talk about what was most challenging and ultimately rewarding for an experienced wordsmith by yourself by then, with constructing the story that became A Ladder in the Sky.
I wrote about publishing and I wrote about manipulation, and it's dark and it's funny. I like the structure of it, the 3 sections of time and the 2 interludes between them. I think the first interlude that features Gore Vidal is maybe the best section of a book that I've written. And I just like the central character Morris because, again, he's quite ambiguous. He's a horrible human being. He's terribly manipulative, but at the same time, he's quite honest about who he is. Like in the first section, when he is manipulating Eric, but Eric is manipulating him too. And Morris does point that out to him at the end of that section, saying, look, you don't have me along on this book tours because I'm a fantastic secretary. You have me along for a different reason, and you have to face up to that. And I think it's a really interesting, strange sort of a novel, and owes something in its way to The Talented Mr. Ripley. I love Patricia Highsmith and those kind of books where the sort of the anti-hero, and I think Morris is a pretty good anti-hero. Yeah, because there's 3 different narrators, I think, in that book, and it is a challenge, but it's an exciting challenge. It's fun, and I trust myself very much. I trust my instincts on it, and with each of those sections, having a different narrator, and then finishing with Morris narrating the 3rd section, just seemed right to me. I thought we'd get a view of him from the different perspectives before, and then he will come in at the end, and we'll see, are we right or wrong about who he is. But I think challenge is good, but I think if you're excited by the book that you're writing, and then that's going to come across in the writing, and the reader is going to feel excited. And I felt very excited writing that. I felt like it's a good page turner, and like people want to know what happens next, and interesting characters.
We'd love it if you would talk a bit about what's involved in creating a 2,000-year story arc, as you did along the way to crafting what became A Traveler at the Gates of Wisdom.
I did. I had a massive spreadsheet starting at the year 0 and going all the way to the year 2080. And I knew I wanted 51 countries and a spaceship, because then there'd be one for every week of the year. And it was, it's such an ambitious book, and I think a very interesting book. It wasn't a book that did very well for me, I have to say, but I think it's slightly overlooked because I think there's a huge amount in it, and all the connections between the different periods of history. I keep moving forward by about 40 years in every chapter, give or take. And there's a lot of links back to my earlier books. It came out when COVID was happening. So, there just wasn't a huge audience for that one. But it's one I look back on, I think, is maybe slightly underrated. Those things have a second life, and you never know when a book will just return and capture somebody's attention, and it'll be promoted by somebody in the media or something, and it'll just take off. You never know.
That is magic when it happens. Now, Smartbones would take center stage as a character in the echo chamber, which the observer found, like so many readers, to be a funny, rumbustious, unstinting, and wonderfully Hogarthian work. What made you chuckle enough to want to write your first comedy, even with such serious subject matter as you did here?
Because I'd never written a comedy before, and it began with a young adult book I'd written called My Brother's Name is Jessica, which was about a trans teenager, which came in for an awful lot of online abuse by people who hadn't actually read the book. And, because if you entered that conversation about trans people, they just go insane anyway, and they just accuse you of all sorts. But, and I thought, it was just such a ridiculous experience, the way these people carried on. And I just wanted to write about social media and why people spend so much time on it, and why people care about it so much, and how damaging it can actually be to people in their lives. And, I was on Twitter for a while, for a good few years, up to that point. And I found myself getting sucked into it as well, and thinking, why am I arguing with strangers? It's pointless, and you can never win an argument on it because everybody digs their heels in. So I just wanted to write about that, but I wanted to make it as farcical as possible and as funny as possible. And I was really pleased with the response to that, because that just got like maybe the best reviews of my career, and won prizes and sold really well. And I think it was nice just to kind of lighten up and just tell jokes for a change. And God knows social media can lead you to jokes. Because I think the two hardest things are to make people scared or to make people laugh. I don't think it's as difficult to make people cry. And a lot of my books kind of are quite sad. And I think I know how to do that. But making people laugh is difficult. I think if you get a good narrative voice from the start, and a light sort of tone, a light touch to it, and conflicting personalities where, you can have a grumpy person and a funny person, and the grumpy person will usually be funnier. But again, it's always in the rewriting and trying to get as many jokes in as possible, cut anything that doesn't seem funny, write characters that are completely larger than life and over the top. I mean, most of the characters in the echo chamber they couldn't possibly exist in real life. They're so ridiculous. But by making them so ridiculous, I think is where the humor comes. If I made them normal, I don't think it would be as funny. I think the fact that they're all completely crazy is what makes the book work. And I definitely wanted the reader to kind of get the point that I was making, that there's a big world out there, and we don't have to live on our phones all day, every day, and we shouldn't be, as I was, getting stressed about the opinions of complete strangers. It's just you gain nothing from it. It only upsets your day.
The Guardian would hail your next novel as a powerful one about secrets and atonement after Auschwitz, creating what they hailed as a defense of literature's need to shine a light on the darkest aspects of human nature, and it does so with a novelist's skill, precision, and power here. When did you first decide you wanted to write a sequel to The Boy with Striped Pajamas, this time told through 91-year-old Gretel Fernsby's story in all the broken places?
It was the first sequel that I've written, and it was a sequel, of course, to Boyne with Striped Pajamas. But way back when I wrote Striped Pajamas, I always knew that I wanted to return to Gretel at some point. And I thought when I was much older, I often thought it would be like the last book I would write when I was in my 80s or 90s. But I wrote it during COVID, during lockdown. And it seemed the right time, because somebody like Gretel, the daughter of a commandant at a concentration camp, could still be alive today, could be 91. Taking the timeline from Striped Pajamas, she would be 91 in 2022. So I wanted to finish her story and to balance it with Bruno's, because in Bruno's story, of course, it's the naivety of a child who knows nothing about what his father is doing. In Gretel's story, it's a 91-year-old who knows everything about what her father has done. And how does that affect your life? How do you go through life knowing what your father has been responsible for? Again, the sense of complicity is there, the sense of guilt, of shame, of regret, the fact that she's hidden this secret all the way through her life. And I wanted to, and I didn't know where I would take her, but I knew I wanted to just start her voice and then let the story build in front of me. And it built very quickly and very happily for me. I guess because I had been talking about these characters for so many years, I knew exactly who she was when I came to write her. I think it's one of the strongest first-person narrators I've written. I knew she would be a tough old bird, as they say, and nobody's fool, but inside, somewhere hidden away, there would be warmth, but fear of discovery as well. And she would have the courage she didn't have for many years when she's in her 90s, and she would be searching without realizing she's searching. She'd be searching for a moment of atonement before her own death, something that she can do to make up for the crimes that her family's been responsible for, and an opportunity comes for her. I mean, it was very interesting for me to write that, and also to bookend, between like my most commercially successful book, my most famous book, to go back to that and feel that I've completed that story. Also, I like the idea of, I don't know of another sequel where it's the first book is a YA book and the sequel is an adult book. And I thought that was even interesting in itself. And between the two, because Bruno is 9, she's 91, I'm exactly halfway between the two. So I thought it was the right time and place.
How much fun is it to meet both parents and kids these days, in line at book signings together these days?
No, I do get people coming up to me at signings saying that with a kid and telling me that they'd read the book when they were in school. They've got a kid. It makes me feel about 100, but it's very nice. I think joining a writing group is really, really helpful and important. I think because then you have deadlines, you have an audience, and I honestly think you learn more from reading other people's work and going into class every week and being able to talk about it than you do from them talking about yours. And then you are really thinking about writing, you're thinking about words, you're thinking about why is this piece working or not working, or what is working in it and what isn't working. So writing groups definitely, and those deadlines, really, really helpful. It sounds obvious, but a lot of time people don't do it, which is just to be reading all the time. I've taught classes to younger people where I've asked what they're reading, and half of them aren't reading. And you think, you want to be a writer, but you're not reading? I don't get it. And I think, just making that space every day, not waiting for inspiration to strike, being disciplined and focused, getting up early if you have to go to work. I used to get up when I worked in the bookshop and was trying to get my career off the ground. I used to get up at 5 o'clock and I'd write for 2 hours before going to work. And then I could go into the shop and I would know I have done another couple of pages. And no matter what happens at the end of the day, if we go for a drink or whatever's going on, I've still done it. And I just have to get up tomorrow and do it.
Do you intend to keep writing in tandem for both YA and adult audiences?
Yeah, I do. I think I'm going to do a few more picture books for the time being, and then when I have an idea for another YA book, I will. But I quite like the idea of maybe doing a few picture books over the next few years. It seems like a fun experience. The next thing I'm publishing, it starts in November. I'm doing something different for me, a 4-book sequence of novellas, 40,000 words each: water, earth, fire, air, the elements. And each one is narrated by a minor character from the previous one, but they're all self-contained stories. But each one will be, they will be connected in some way. So we're going to publish them in November, May for 2 years, and then package them up as the elements at the end of that. So I've written the first 2, I'm writing the 3rd one at the moment, and I have to figure out what the 4th one's going to be about. It's really it's a very thematic one, like a narrator where, like say in Water, where water is the theme of the book, that it's affected her life. I don't really want to tell the story too much yet because it hasn't come out, but that water is a very important aspect of her life. And the same in the second one, Earth, where the earth is. So I'm just really trying to kind of use a theme and write very quiet stories about them. The next thing for young people is actually I'm doing a picture book for very young kids, like for the 3-4-year-old age group, called The Dog Who Danced on the Moon, and like a 32-page one, and it rhymes, the whole thing, and it's about a little boy who wants to be an astronaut and his dog who wants to be a dancer, and they go off to the moon and dance. But it's full of fun and it's full of jokes and it all rhymes. So, and obviously it's being illustrated. So I think it's something fun. It's something completely new for me. Hearts Invisible Furies is 203,000 words long. The Dog Who Danced on the Moon is 800 words long. So, for these 800 words, every single word really, really matters more than ever before. Every comma matters. The rhythm of the language, the rhythm of the rhymes, and still being able to tell an interesting story within such a short amount of space. I found it very challenging. I found it very interesting working with my editor on that, because he really kind of takes no prisoners on every word and would challenge me on it. And I think it's made me a better writer, actually.
You're now in your 3rd decade of making a living and impact with words. What in that spirit's on the horizon that your longtime loyal fan base can look forward to immersing themselves in next?
I think joining a writing group is really, really helpful and important. I think because then you have deadlines, you have an audience. And I honestly think you learn more from reading other people's work and going into class every week and being able to talk about it than you do from them talking about yours. And then you are really thinking about writing, you're thinking about words, you're thinking about why is this piece working or not working, or what is working in it and what isn't working. So writing groups definitely, and those deadlines, really, really helpful. It sounds obvious, but a lot of time people don't do it, which is just to be reading all the time. I've taught classes to younger people where I've asked what they're reading, and half of them aren't reading. And you think, you want to be a writer, but you're not reading? I don't get it. And I think, just making that space every day, not waiting for inspiration to strike, being disciplined and focused, getting up early if you have to go to work. I used to get up when I worked in the bookshop and was trying to get my career off the ground. I used to get up at 5 o'clock and I'd write for 2 hours before going to work. And then I could go into the shop and I would know I have done another couple of pages. And no matter what happens at the end of the day, if we go for a drink or whatever's going on, I've still done it. And I just have to get up tomorrow and do it.
John, it was fascinating talking today. Thank you so much for taking out time to be on About the Authors TV.
Okay, great. Nice talking to you.